Space Marines are kind of having a moment right now, and despite having played Warhammer since the 3rd edition box set came out, I've never actually painted up a Space Marine. Not including Thousand Suns, of course. I'm talking like regular Space Marines. And I do have this one free miniature of the month kicking around, but I just needed to figure out which chapter to paint him as. He's equipped with grenades, so kind of wanted something that leaned into that. I also really love painting rusty and weathered metal. That, combined with their fondness towards siege warfare and, I assume, blowing things up, made the Iron Warriors a pretty perfect choice. The Sons of Perturabo are known for trudging through the mud and fighting grueling battles, so I thought a really weathered and grimdark paint scheme would be really cool. Well, the Iron Warriors are a super pragmatic legion and would probably wear any armor they could get their hands on. Leaving the Imperial Eagle on the chest feels like a bit of a cop-out, so we're gonna remove it. Interestingly enough, in the book Angel Exterminatus, Perturabo actually scolds an Iron Warrior for referring to the Astartes on the other side of the Horus Heresy as the Loyalists, since this would make the Iron Warriors and their allies traitors. Instead, he says they are only victors and the vanquished. So with that in mind, let's vanquish this by first getting rid of most of the bulk with an X-Acto knife, and then smoothing it out with a sanding twig. Trying to do the best job we can, but knowing that this area is going to be super rusty, so if it's not perfect, that's okay. I wanted to do a simple head swap here, but make sure it didn't look too corrupted. Iron Warriors definitely utilize demon engines and have obliterators amongst their ranks, but they're also prone to disliking and removing more mundane mutations. So for this guy, I wanted to use this spiky Warriors of Chaos helmet. It has a straightforward chaos look to it, but also a certain uniqueness that reminds me of the Iron Warriors, with the helmet looking like its own tiny barricaded fortress. I removed a bit of the neck so it would fit more snugly into the Space Marine torso. Overall, it's a tiny bit small, but I sort of enjoyed the proportion of it, making him look appropriately villainous and tying into that knightly vambrace on his left arm. For paint, I started with a black prime and then did an all-over base coat of NATO black. This is a super matte color, and combined with the thinness of the paint, it was still a little uneven after 2 coats, but not really that big of a deal since we're just setting up a nice dark color for our weathered metal to go over. Then we're going to stipple on some Doombull brown. I take a brush usually used for dry brushing with a small amount of paint and dab it onto the model, creating a bunch of dots. Combining this with a typical dry brush, I try and create a gradient going from full coverage at the very top of the model and fading down to about the knees. I then water the Doombull brown down until it's really runny and flow it into all the nooks and cracks and details around the legs and feet where the elements would collect, emulating rust. I finish this rusty undercoat by stippling on orange brown. I apply this in a similar way to the previous layer with a denser, more opaque coverage towards the top of the model, but making sure I still have some of the Doombull brown showing through. I want this to look splotchy and make sure all that stippling is leaving small marks and I'm developing a nice visual texture. This is then watered down and ran into the edges and details like the vents, and then also just into the corners and extreme sections on the areas that already had this treatment with the Doombull brown. This is going to give a great rusty base coat to then start applying our metallic paints over. You can see how we've developed a natural highlight with our gradient from light to dark. So for the metallics, we're going to follow this up by doing the same thing with the super appropriately named Iron Warriors. This is a base paint from Citadel, so it's important to thin it down with a bit of water since it's pretty thick. This is then stippled on in a similar way, making sure the rust is still visible. denser with more coverage on top, fading down the model but stopping at the knees. For that section, we're going to give them a dry brush of Iron Warriors. This technique leaves the hard to reach areas nice and rusty and overall fades into a super dark iron color on the legs. The coverage here can be dialed up or down depending on how weathered and rusty of a look you're going for. I'm aiming for something suitably worn and weathered, but still very recognizable as the metallic color of the Iron Warriors. For areas like the shoulder pad trim and neck guard, we're going to use a typical brush and add some Iron Warriors to small areas that would be catching the light. We're going to continue this gradient and use Stormhose Silver to highlight the metal, stippling some onto just choice areas like the very top of the shoulder pads and power pack. Also hitting the more exposed section of the chest plate. For more control with the stippling throughout the paint job, you could also use a small piece of pluck foam or whatever else works for you. The important part is just to be making small dots to emulate rust and weathered metal. We're going to reinforce the highlight on the extreme parts of the shoulder trim and neck guard and other sharp ridged areas, hitting an even smaller area with Stormhose Silver. We're then going to do a super faint dry brush around the torso and arms, just to pick out the edges on things that needed a little more definition. With that, the metallics are done. You might have noticed I've kind of avoided too much paint on the one shoulder pad, and that's because we're going to be laying down the trademark of the Iron Warriors, those nice hazard stripes. You can use your favorite yellow paint recipe or paint, but I'll be using this Diarylide Yellow, a fluid acrylic from Golden. Since this is sort of a weathered and grimdark paint scheme, instead of full opacity, we're going to be leaning into the natural transparency of yellow paint and apply it with irregular mark making, building up some visual texture. You can see how I've left a tattered edge along the bottom of the shoulder pad, giving the yellow a worn appearance. I'm going to be highlighting the yellow by adding some white and using the same stippling technique to pick out the peak of the shoulder pad. This ended up being a bit extreme, so I'm going to fade it into the rest of the shoulder pad by glazing on some yellow, pulling away from the highlighted area. I wanted to make sure the yellow was thoroughly dried before adding the stripes, so while I waited, I painted the grenade in his hand and all the areas in the joints with NATO black. I then added white to this to create a gray, which I used to pick out some of the individual tubing. I also take this moment to add some texture paste to the base and then leave it all to dry. For the stripes, we're going to first measure out little strips of painter's tape and cut it accordingly. I then apply them to the shoulder pad, trying to choose an angle that will look good when viewing the model from the front. I used the little Citadel texture paste spatula to wedge the tape into the corners and get it to lay flat. I place strips of tape side by side instead of leaving the gap, since I want to make sure I have the placement nice and straight and can use the previous ones as a guide. Once they've all been placed, I remove alternating pieces of tape, creating the pattern. When I first took a look at this, I was a bit worried there wasn't going to be enough yellow showing through, so I adjusted the tape, moving them slightly closer together. But as you'll see later, this ended up being a bit of a mistake, so I kind of wish I just left them as is. As a side note, shoulder pads aren't really the best thing to be doing this type of masking on. They're really small and curved, which makes applying the painter's tape kind of weird. If I were to do this off camera, I'd probably just freehand it, but I wanted to show a really cool way to get super straight, crispy lines. And if you are watching this video, maybe you have an Iron Warriors army with lots of tanks and vehicles which feature big flat panels, which are pretty perfect for this type of thing. One of the hiccups with masking off sections with painter's tape is that the paint sometimes still bleeds through, ruining that perfect edge, which is super annoying since it sort of undermines the entire point of doing this. To prevent this, we can use something transparent to seal the edges. Anything like lamy and medium or matte varnish should do the trick, but I'm going to be using watered down matte medium and paint this over the edges of the painter's tape. Once this is thoroughly dried, I start painting in my stripes with NATO black, opting for short brush strokes since I'm trying to avoid flooding the area with too much paint, which could seep under the painter's tape. I'm then going to add a bit of white to the NATO black to create a gray to highlight the black stripes as they curve towards the top of the shoulder pad. Once it's time to remove the tape, you can see what a nice job the matte medium did at sealing the edges, creating some really crisp lines. However, the black stripes are a bit too thin, and I think overall the shoulder pad is too pristine for this type of paint job. So I add a bit of thickness to the lines and soften the edges. To tie it in with the rest of the scheme, I take some watered down orange brown and glaze it onto the shoulder pad, pulling it into the bottom corner. This helps to add definition, but also creates a rusty and weathered look. I layer this with some chipping by stippling on NATO black very sparingly. I alternate these two techniques with the orange-brown glaze helping to knock back some of the chipping and overall creating a really nice, varied, and battle-worn look. A nice final touch is to mix white and yellow and add just a tiny highlight to the underside of some of the more prominent black specks. I then also add some iron warriors to the larger areas of chipping. The grenade pouches are picked out with charred brown with incremental amounts of white added to it for the highlights, and iron warrior used on the metal snaps and buckle. Stormhose silver is then used to pick out the details on the held grenade, helping it stand out. The visor is given a glowy look by first brushing in a bit of water into the eye slit, and then some white paint is flowed in. These same steps are repeated with electric blue before a small bit of white is added on top to complete the look. I originally painted the base with a sandy sort of color, which I didn't think totally worked. It was a little too light and warm, making the whole model too one note. Instead, I opted for more contrast by using NATO black with some white added to create a gray, and adding more white for additional highlights. And after a final victory lap with NATO black, he was done. Known for their brutal tactics and penchant for digging in the mud, I think this paint scheme did a great job at capturing the Iron Warrior's brooding nature. It was super fun painting up some really weathered metal in a more grimdark fashion. It was really quick and I think really lends itself to a larger force also, and could be adapted for lots of different tasks, including war machines, worn weaponry, or even some grimdark stormcasts. With just some layers of stippling, a lot of visual interest was created, and you can kind of see how it could be pushed and pulled to suit your individual needs and fit into your hobby time. Thanks for watching.